Hello, everyone. Welcome to day 5 of week 1. We are going to delve deeper into developing habits for ourselves to ultimately drive the behaviors that help us to create consistency in terms of our success. And today we are going to focus on the A part of that BJ Fogg equation, accessibility. And what does that mean? Remember, accessibility is one of those two main levers that we can pull on. The other one being motivation. We discussed that previously this week. Accessibility is all about how to make something difficult easier to do to increase the probability that that difficult task gets done. And that's because things that are harder to do are less likely to be done, and things that are easier to do are more likely to be done. So how can we necessarily do something that is more difficult to do? Well, if we look at the formula, we can exponentially drive up motivation and just like plow right through the difficult task. We could psych ourselves up so much that we just work 100 hours and get it done and figure it out. Maybe we figure it out. I don't know how likely something like that is. There's been a couple of points in my career where I have worked 100 hours a week for multiple weeks in order to make something happen. Specifically, this was for a joint venture that I was working on, and we had a tight timeline. That was really not sustainable, and that's not something I can do every time I am challenged with a difficult task. So creating that motivation and that drive, like, not everybody's Tony Robbins. That guy's amazing at creating motivation in people and getting them to look at things differently, but we don't all operate in that way. And my personal view is that really is not necessarily sustainable. So what can we do where we're not just creating that overwhelming motivation to plow through the difficult task to make that difficult task a reality, and not only a reality, but to consistently deliver on it? And it's not the motivation part of the equation, it's the accessibility part of the equation. And again, habits are all about like the steps that we can take, making them doable, and then actually doing them. So we're going to do that here. What are some steps that we can take to make a difficult task more accessible? So what you see on the screen, break something difficult down to smaller and smaller task options. That would be the first step. So what are the smaller things that you can do? And that can be the incremental steps, but also at each step, are there a series of options that you can consider in order to make that smaller step happen? And then determine which of these tasks and or options or alternatives are the easiest for you to do. So based upon your skill set, your prior experience, certain things may be easier to do. You can do something really quick. Something that might be hard for someone else might be easy for you, and vice versa. So which of those things are difficult, which of those things are easy? And then pick that prompt. So the P part of the equation that reminds you to do it, that naturally kind of pushes you in to do it. And then when you're prompted, do it. And of course, add the celebration piece. And the thing that's like key here is that when we pick these things that we are more inclined to do that help us to get towards our goal, that are pieces of the sum that we need to achieve, successfully doing that creates the motivation. And the motivation that creates might be enough to accomplish the next step, which might be slightly more difficult. And we build on that. And that's how this works. This leveraging of motivation and accessibility together works. And the next step in the process is to pick that next task, or to repeat the current task, or to make that current task slightly more difficult, and to build that over time. So let me give a an example. Let's say you are tasked with deploying $150 million budget. That can be like extremely overwhelming. Well, what would I do in that circumstance? I would start thinking about all the smaller tasks I would need to do to effectively and efficiently allocate that budget. And some of the immediate steps that I would take would be around inputs. Remember, I want to create value: input, throughput, output, outcome. So what are the inputs that I would consider so that I can do something efficiently, effectively, and consistently deliver success? So some of those steps that I would recognize are, number one, I need more information. I'm probably lacking information, and one of the reasons I'm feeling anxious, which is the opposite of motivation, is because I don't necessarily yet know how I'm going to do this, and that makes this task overwhelmingly difficult. So I need that information. How can I get that information? Well, who's going to be impacted by this budget? Who's going to need access to this budget? So first step, like, who's impacted? Who needs access to this budget? So I'd write down all the stakeholders. That I can do. That's pretty easy for me. That's something that is not that complicated. It is completely within my control, and I can commit to it and get that done quickly. And I can be prompted by putting something in my calendar that says spend 15 minutes determining who are the top 10 people that are impacted by this $150 million budget. And then from there, okay, like, great, I did 15 minutes, great work, you figured it out, these seem like the right people. What's the next step that I need to take in that process? Well, what would be easy for me here? Well, I love speaking with people, and I love doing like consulting work and finding out all the details about something so that ultimately I can synthesize this thing that is a great solution. In this case, a very high performing budget. So what I would do for me, because it's easy and would help me towards the solution, I would pick 3 people to prioritize 3 people. That's my next step, prioritize 3 people from that list. Okay, so 2 steps accomplished. I've got my list of 10, I've got my list of priority 3 people, and those 3 people I want to speak with. So I'm going to schedule 3 meetings with those 3 people. And that's my 3rd step, to schedule the meeting. And then my 4th step is to actually have the first meeting. 5th step, the 2nd meeting. The 6th step, the 3rd meeting. And I am slowly taking these practical incremental steps, driving towards my goal in the systematic approach. And I'm managing my motivation by focusing things on likely and probable to do well and comfortable with, to drive me towards where I want to be. So you may encounter a situation where you don't feel motivated to do anything. Like, what should you be doing? That you need to find the thing that you can, out of all your options, that you can make most accessible and most easy by breaking it down into further steps and understand what's completely within your control. An alternate solution that I could have taken, besides talking to people, which is something that is not as motivating for me, I maybe could start doing some research in terms of what needs to be accomplished with the budget in the different areas. Likely would be a wise decision. So at some point after I speak with people and do that research, maybe there's more written research or documented things that I would need to review that could help me to make decisions. So I could outline, okay, what types of searches can I do to acquire that information? That's relatively easy to do, and I can motivate myself by help to get me more data points so that I can increase the likelihood that I would be successful. So you see how I'm taking this logical and incremental approach by pulling on motivation and accessibility, and specifically on the accessibility side, breaking things down into smaller and incremental steps, alternative steps to help me to accomplish this goal of eventually getting an efficient and effective allocation of this $150 million budget, which is my output. And the outcome that I want is that I hope in actuality, when the budget gets used, that what I did is pretty damn close to what the actual outcome or the implementation of the budget is. So you can apply this at a much smaller scale. A quick example there is like, let's take working out. A lot of people, we aspire to going to the gym, but sometimes the gym is maybe 15 minutes away. It's 25 degrees Fahrenheit out and we find reasons not to go. So what's the smallest possible step I can take in my aspiration of being more healthy and having more energy, and working out is a method for me to do that. I can find something to trigger some kind of activity that focuses on my physical health. And what could be a very small version of that? Well, if I like to do a chest workout, maybe, and I'm not going to the gym, how can I do that if I'm at home? Well, I can do a push-up. Push-ups enable that. I can do that anywhere, so that's pretty accessible. And if I set a goal of doing like 20 push-ups at first, I might have the motivation initially to do that, but every time I decide to do it, I may not always have the motivation. So the most minimal step there I would do would be to do a single push-up. And when should I do that single push-up? So how about every time I use the bathroom? Every time I use the bathroom, I am going to do one push-up. And every time I do that one push-up, I'm just going to say to myself, I did it. And just celebrate that for 1 second. And then maybe I do that for a week. And then the next week, I'm going to make that task slightly more difficult. And every time I use the bathroom, maybe I'll do 2 or 3 push-ups. And I'll build that over time. And that will help me to get to my aspiration of having better health and energy, better physical health, so that I can play the role of dad that I want to with my young children. So that was a very simplistic version of applying accessibility. And I initially explained the more complex version of that using, in a business setting, a budget, and breaking that difficult task down into smaller pieces that ultimately generates the value that we want to target. And the framework gives us that ability to consistently do something and increase the probability of a successful result. All right, so the action item for today, again, we're building habits, and we're going to build a habit around accessibility. So making something difficult a little bit easier. And the form, the link to that will just guide you through this process, get you to do it one time, and then it's up to you to apply it. Remember, learn something, apply it immediately. That helps to make it stick. So now we are at the end of week 1. Congratulate yourself. You watched the first 5 days of content. Hopefully you've done some of the accountability items and applied and are applying what you're learning in your daily operations as a leader. And what's the big takeaway here? I mentioned at the start of the program, like, scholars have created over 200 definitions of leadership. And in my mind, this is all what leadership is. It's the totality of the goals we pick and the decisions we make, our ability to motivate ourselves and others to make our targeted outcomes more accessible and consistently probable. So what we covered this week is our ability to motivate ourselves and to, as well as make more things accessible for ourselves in order to make success actually more consistently probable. So what we're going to focus on next week is team empowerment habits. So how can you use the levers of motivation and accessibility, and not just for yourself, but with your team, to drive the behaviors and the outcomes and to generate the value consistently that helps your team members and you to get those significant accomplishments and also to become more effective leaders. So great job this week going through the program overview, understanding what it means to build habits, thinking about and hopefully applying some form of transient and sustainable motivation, as well as today, focusing on accessibility and what it means to make things more accessible for yourself. All right, so I will see you next week on day 1 when we start to talk about team empowerment. Have a great weekend.